Propaganda in the 70s, Chapter 3 of Alex Carey's study on managing public opinion, the corporate offensive. The corporate campaigns to influence and change public opinion during the pre- and post-war periods have been largely directed at the grassroots, with a primary purpose of reaching large numbers of people directly and thereby changing public opinion. These campaigns continue into the 70s, and they are necessary. First Vietnam, then Watergate produced a disastrous collapse in public regard for all American institutions, and for business in particular. So in 1975, the Advertising Council again initiated a national program of conservative economic education on a scale similar to the post-war program. In 1977, Fortune described the continuing Ad Council campaign as a study in gigantism, saturating the media and reaching practically everybody. By 1978, according to expert witnesses before a congressional inquiry, American business was spending $1 billion per year on grassroots propaganda. The effectiveness of the new propaganda program was monitored by a standardized, vastly detailed poll sponsored by the Advertising Council and repeated every 12 months. By 1980, the annual poll showed that the proportion of Americans who think there is too much government regulation, a matter at the very heart of the new right propagandists' concerns, had risen from 42% to 60%. Ronald Reagan's election followed. A New York firm which specializes in monitoring public opinion for business reviewed the changed mood of American politics and observed,
"Between Jimmy Carter's election in 1976 and Ronald Reagan's victory in 1980, the outlook of the American people underwent one of those decisive shifts that historians generally label as watershed events."
The review speculates about possible explanations for the startling reversal of public opinion, but it entirely overlooks business's billion-dollar propaganda campaigns. Again, as in 1919-21 and 1945-50, a business-sponsored assault on public opinion coincides with a dramatic swing to conservatism. And still, the meaning of all this for democracy is not raised in any substantial way. Yet another form of propaganda is developed in the 70s. It is the hallmark of the emerging neoconservative movement, and Alex Carey calls it, as distinct from the traditional grassroots, the treetops propaganda. What you're about to hear now is a chapter on think tanks and their role in the election of Ronald Reagan, from Alex Carey's study, Managing Public Opinion, the Corporate Offensive. The 1970s in the United States and United Kingdom, treetops propaganda. Treetops propaganda is not directed at the person in the street. It is directed to influencing a select audience of influential people, policymakers in Parliament and the civil service, newspaper editors and columnists, economics debate on TV and radio. Its immediate purpose is to set the terms of debate, to determine the kind of questions that will dominate public discussion. In a word, to set the political agenda in ways which are favorable to corporate interests. As this tactic succeeds, public discussion no longer assumes, for example, that affluent societies have a first responsibility to provide jobs for all who want them, and the debate is instead about whether 6% or 10% is a natural, and by implication, acceptable level of unemployment. It is no longer taken for granted that we have a right to clean air, and the debate centers on how far the cost to industry of pollution control is economically acceptable. The debate ceases to be about how far it is necessary for government to be involved in the economy, and centers on arguments for reduced involvement and schedules for achieving this. The debate is no longer about whether unions have too much power, or even too little power given the huge size of contemporary corporations, but about which is the best way to reduce that power. The tactics by which such changes in the political agenda are secured is for the corporations to search out articulate conservative economists and amenable academics, gather them together in lavishly funded, tax-deductible think tanks, and pay them handsomely to inundate relevant debate with an endless stream of books and research reports. In the U.S., the work of the many private think tanks which develop policies on a range of national issues is known as policy research. Such organizations have been around for a long time, some more right-wing, like the Conference Board and the Hoover Institution, others less right-wing, like the Brookings Institution and the Committee for Economic Development. The 1970s saw the emergence of an aggressive new breed among these organizations, which, lavishly funded by corporations, produced an incessant flow of market-oriented studies. Perhaps most importantly, the new think tanks placed a quite new emphasis on promoting and disseminating their products nationwide, that is, on proselytizing. The new or revitalized think tanks and the scholars they recruited virtually created the neoconservative movement of the 1970s. I would like to add here another observation from Noam Chomsky, an observation that addresses the particular danger of propaganda that is directed not at the people at large, but at the educated parts of the population.
One reason that propaganda often works better on the educated than on the uneducated is that educated people read more, so they receive more propaganda. Another is that they're the commissars. They have jobs as agents of propaganda, and they believe it. By and large, they're part of the privileged elite and share their interests and perceptions. The rest of the population is more marginalized. It doesn't participate in the democratic system, which is overwhelmingly an elite game.
Such propaganda directed at the educated, the elites, at lawmakers, as well as those who interpret the laws, is the main function of think tanks. The most important of the new think tanks is the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research, AEI, founded in 1943 with money from Lilly Endowment, Ford, Weyerhaeuser, and Reader's Digest. AEI gained such importance during the first Reagan campaign that it assumed almost mythical powers with Reagan's first election, and, according to the New York Times, a consultant to frustrated Democratic Party members told them, quote, "They ought to remember that AEI did not win the election, but that Reagan did." End of quote. Reagan himself, however, gratefully acknowledged the support he had received from AEI. One of the first visits he paid to anyone after his election was to the AEI, where he received a standing ovation. Reagan addressed the meeting and said, quote, "I just want you to know that we'll be looking closely at your observations and proposals. This kind of working relationship with the AEI is one the next administration wants to maintain during the next 4 years." End of Reagan quote. Reagan then proceeded to choose 6 top appointees for his first administration from the pool of AEI scholars. As a cheerleader for the free market economy, the Heritage Foundation organizes communication among what it calls a resource bank of 1,000 academics and several hundred other policy research groups. In 1978, the president of the foundation, Dr. Foner, addressed an international conference of corporate opinion managers assembled in London. "The American public policy arena," he reported happily, "is awash with in-depth academic studies, which lead to the inescapable conclusion that the free market operates more efficiently, more humanely, and less expensively than any planned statist or socialist alternative."